Okay, let's unpack this. We have a tendency, I think, when we look back at the history of the 20th century, to focus on the heavy hitters. We look at London, we look at Berlin, Moscow, Washington. We read the history of the winners, or at least the major
But the
power.
great power narrative, right? It's the standard way history is taught.
Right. But what if I told you that to really understand the absolute insanity of the last century, the collapse of empires, the rise of fascism, the friction of the Cold War, the role of the intellectual in totalitarianism, you shouldn't be looking at a capital city in the West. You should be looking at a specific villa in Zagreb, Croatia.
That is a bold claim.
Yeah.
But, looking at the stack of research we have here, it actually holds up. It really does.
We're diving deep today into the life and work of Miroslav Krleža, and frankly, just calling him a writer feels like we're underselling it massively.
Oh, completely. It's like calling Da Vinci a sketch artist.
Exactly. Based on the source material, this man was a novelist, a playwright, a poet, an essayist, a philosopher, an encyclopedist, and a military critic. It's an insane resume.
And a political rebel who then somehow became a political institution. That's the part that's so hard to wrap your head around.
It really is. He is widely, and I mean widely, considered the greatest Croatian writer of the 20th century. But beyond all the accolades, his life is this perfect, jagged line through every single major geopolitical earthquake of the region.
Just think about the timeline for a second. He's born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Right.
He lives through its collapse. He lives through the chaotic, messy creation of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. He survived the fascist puppet state during World War II.
Which was incredibly dangerous for someone like him.
Terrifying. And then he becomes a central, pivotal figure in socialist Yugoslavia. And he dies just 1 year after Marshal Tito. His life is the story of that century in that part of the world.
He didn't just survive these eras. He defined the cultural response to them. And that's the mission for this deep dive. We want to figure out how one man could be, and this is a great phrase, a communist of his own making. How he could be a close personal advisor to an authoritarian president and at the same time be a literary rebel who absolutely refused to write propaganda.
It's the ultimate story of the insider-outsider. How do you maintain your intellectual soul when the world around you is constantly demanding total obedience?
And to understand that, we have to go right back to the start. Because the contradictions in Krleža's life, they start literally with his education.
They really do. It's the perfect place to begin.
Let's get into part one then, the soldier and the spy. So the origins. He's born July 7th, 1893 in Zagreb.
And it's crucial context to remember that Zagreb, at that point, was in Croatia's Slavonia, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
So not an independent nation.
Not at all. It was the periphery of a vast, multi-ethnic empire ruled from Vienna.
And his background wasn't aristocratic, was it? He didn't come from money.
No, not at all. Quite modest. His father was a police constable, so, a state functionary, but very much lower middle class.
But Miroslav, even as a kid, was clearly different.
Oh, a prodigy. By all accounts, he was fiercely brilliant, incredibly intellectual, very sensitive, always reading. And you have to put yourself in the mindset of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. If you have a bright, disciplined boy from a modest background, there was one very clear, very established path for social mobility.
The military.
Precisely. The officer corps.
So this future literary titan, this sensitive poet who would write some of the most scathing anti-war literature ever, he starts out by choice in a military academy. That's the paradox.
That's the first great irony of his life. He is enrolled in a preparatory military school in Pécs, which is in modern-day Hungary. And from there, he goes to the very prestigious Ludovicium Military Academy in Budapest.
So he is being groomed to be an officer of the emperor. He's wearing the uniform. He's learning the discipline, the tactics. He is inside the machine.
He is in the belly of the beast. But you have to understand the atmosphere of, say, 1912, 1913. The air is electric.
The whole system is starting to fray.
It's crumbling. Nationalism is boiling over everywhere, but especially in the Balkans. Young Croats, young Serbs, young Slovenes are looking around and feeling like they're living in what they called a prison of nations.
And they're looking across the border.
They are looking across the border at the Kingdom of Serbia.
Serbia was seen as the Piedmont, right? That's the historical comparison I've seen.
Yes, that's the term they used. Just as the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia had united Italy, the South Slavic nationalists believed that Serbia would be the magnet, the force that would unite all the Slavs against the Austrians and the Hungarians. For them, Serbia was the beacon of freedom.
So Krleža, the promising young cadet in the emperor's army, makes a massive life-altering move. He defects.
It's an incredibly dramatic moment. It's 1913. The Balkan Wars are raging. He literally runs away from the academy. He leaves his uniform, crosses the border, and presents himself to the Serbian authorities.
Now, in his mind, what does he expect is going to happen?
Well, you have to imagine. He's a young romantic. He sees himself as a hero, a patriot. He's leaving the oppressor to offer his sword, or, more accurately, his military training and his intellect to the cause of South Slavic liberation. He probably expects a parade, or at least a warm welcome.
And this is where the movie script takes a very dark, very ironic turn. He doesn't get a parade.
He doesn't even get a handshake. Instead, the Serbs look at him, this very proper young guy with a stiff Austrian military bearing, speaking perfectly educated German and Hungarian, and they get deeply suspicious.
They think he's a spy.
They are absolutely convinced he's an Austrian plant, a provocateur sent to infiltrate them. So instead of giving him a uniform and a rifle, they interrogate him. They humiliate him. And eventually, they just kick him out. They declare him a spy and send him packing, right back to the empire he just deserted.
That is a profound double trauma. You betray your country for a cause, and then the cause itself says, we don't want you. You're not one of us.
It's a complete rejection from both sides. He has nowhere to go. So he has to walk back to Austria-Hungary, knowing what's waiting for him.
And what is waiting for him?
He goes back,
Yeah.
and obviously he is immediately arrested. He's a deserter in wartime. Frankly, he's lucky he wasn't court-martialed and executed, which was a very real possibility.
So what did they do to him?
They stripped him of his rank. They cashiered him from the officer corps. So when World War I breaks out just a year later, in 1914, Miroslav Krleža isn't an officer leading men from the back. He is a common soldier, a grunt.
And they send him to the worst possible place.
They send him to the Eastern Front, to Galicia, to fight the Russians.
We hear so much about the Western Front, you know, the trenches in France, the poetry of Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon. But the Eastern Front was a different kind of hell, wasn't it?
It was a different kind of meat grinder. It was more mobile in some ways, but it was just as brutal. A chaotic, muddy, freezing hellscape. And for Krleža, this was the single most formative experience of his young life.
Because he wasn't in a headquarters moving flags on a map.
No. He was in the mud with the Domobran, the Croatian home defenders, the common soldiers.
And these were peasants, mostly.
Exactly. Poor, uneducated Croatian peasants who didn't care about the Emperor Franz Joseph in Vienna, who probably couldn't point to Vienna on a map, being ordered to slaughter, and be slaughtered by equally poor and uneducated Russian peasants.
He saw the absolute pointless absurdity of it all.
The complete senselessness, the bureaucracy of death, the incompetence of the officers, the suffering. It burned away any last shred of romanticism he might have had about war, or about empires, or about authority.
And this experience is what fuels his first major literary breakthrough, a book called The Croatian God Mars.
Hrvatski Bog Mars. It was published in 1922, a few years after the war ended, and it's technically a collection of short stories, but it reads like a single, cohesive scream against war.
The title alone is fascinating. Mars is the Roman god of war, obviously. Why the Croatian qualifier? What does that imply?
It's a deeply cynical and historical title. It implies that the god of war has a special, specific, and insatiable hunger for Croats. It's a commentary on the history of the nation.
How so?
For centuries, Croatia saw itself as the antemural Christianitatis, the bulwark of Christianity. They were the border guards of Europe, fighting the Ottomans, meaning for centuries they were the ones dying in faraway lands to protect the comfortable center of Europe, whether it was Vienna or Budapest.
So Krleža is basically saying, we are the designated victims of history. We're the cannon fodder.
That's it, exactly. And the stories in the book, they're not about glory. There are no heroes. They're about dysentery and frostbite and bad boots and incompetent officers and the sheer grinding, dehumanizing misery of the trenches. It cemented his lifelong anti-war stance and his deep, deep cynicism toward any kind of authority. You simply cannot understand Krleža as a leftist, Krleža the rebel, without understanding Krleža as a common soldier who saw the empire feeding its own people into a cannon for no reason at all.
Which leads us perfectly into part 2, the literary titan. Because he survives the war. The empire collapses in 1918. We get the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. And Krleža he unleashes. The output it's just staggering.
It's hard to even quantify. In the 1920s and 30s, between the wars, he is writing in every conceivable genre. And we need to talk about his style because it's very, very distinct.
The sources we looked at describe it as a combination of visionary poetic language and sarcasm.
That is the Krleža signature right there. He uses this incredibly rich, dense, baroque, almost poetic language. His sentences can go on for a full page. They're full of subordinate clauses, rich descriptions, philosophical asides.
But it's not just beautiful language for its own sake.
No, because he cuts it with this razor-sharp irony, this acidic sarcasm. It's like he's painting a beautiful classical oil painting full of detail and texture, and then he takes a knife and just slashes the canvas to show you the cheap, ugly wall behind it. He builds up the beautiful facade of bourgeois society, and then he shows you the rot underneath.
And his main target is that bourgeois hypocrisy.
Always. The hypocrisy and conformism of the old Austria-Hungary, and then of the new kingdom of Yugoslavia. He saw it as the same class of people, just with a different flag.
Okay, let's break down the works, starting with the plays. Because if you study theater in that part of the world, Krleža is, he's the god.
He is the central pillar of 20th century Croatian theater. He started out with some very experimental, expressionist plays, things like Adama Eva or Michelangelo Buonarroti, very avant-garde, very symbolic. But he evolved into something more psychological, more naturalist, and that evolution brings us to the Glembays.
Monsieur's Glembay, published in 1929. If there is one single work that our listeners might have heard of or maybe should know, it's probably this one. What is the setup?
Imagine a hugely wealthy, powerful banking family in Zagreb in the early 20th century, the Glembays. They are the absolute pillars of society. They have the sprawling mansion, the priceless art collection, the political connections, the flawless public reputation.
But because this is Krleža, I'm going to assume they are not happy, well-adjusted people.
Oh, not in the slightest. They're a nest of vipers. The entire play and the cycle of plays and stories it belongs to is a meticulous dissection of their moral, psychological, and even biological decay.
Biological decay, what do you mean?
It's about bad blood. Krleža was obsessed with this idea of inherited neurosis and criminality. The Glembay fortune was built on a crime generations ago, and that crime has poisoned the family line. So underneath the veneer of high society, there are secrets, embezzlements, affairs, suicides, and eventually murder.
It sounds a bit like a more literary version of the show Succession, but set in the 1920s.
That is a fantastic comparison. It is exactly that. It's about the rot at the heart of a powerful ruling class family. It's about how money and power corrupt everything they touch. There's a famous line in the play, "The blood has fallen asleep."
The blood has fallen asleep. What does that mean?
It suggests that their vitality, their life force, is gone. It's been replaced by decadence, neurosis, and a kind of spiritual exhaustion.
Right.
Krleža was holding up a mirror to the wealthy bourgeois audience sitting in the theater, and he was showing them that their entire civilization was a lie built on crime and heading for collapse. It was a cultural bomb.
And he didn't just stick to plays. The novels from this period are just as dense, just as important. Let's talk about The Return of Philip Latinowicz from 1932.
Yes. This is often called the first truly modern Croatian novel. It's not an easy read, but it's a brilliant one. It's about an artist, Philip, who returns to his provincial hometown after spending years abroad in the art capitals of Europe.
So it's a classic coming-home story.
It is, but it's a deeply disillusioned one. He's coming home looking for his roots, for connection, for some kind of authentic inspiration to overcome his painter's block. But all he finds is emptiness, hypocrisy, and spiritual decay. It's a novel about the crisis of the modern artist, about alienation, about the inability to truly see or represent reality. It's very Proustian, very existential, a massive leap forward for the novel as a form in that region.
And then, just to show he can do literally anything, a few years later he writes, The Banquet in Blitva.
Banquet u Blitvi. Yes, a total gear shift. This isn't a psychological novel, it's a biting political satire.
The name is kind of funny. Blitva means Swiss chard in Croatian, right?
It does. It's a deliberately ridiculous name for a country. He's mocking the pompousness of these newly formed nations. But the setting and the story are deadly serious. It's set in an imaginary Baltic country, but it's so clearly a stand-in for the rising dictatorships of the 1930s.
So he's looking at what's happening in Germany, Italy, the Soviet Union.
Exactly. The novel is just saturated with the atmosphere of all-pervasive totalitarianism, the paranoia, the secret police, the cult of personality around the dictator, the way language itself is twisted to serve power. He called it a political poem, and it's this furious intellectual scream of warning. He was looking at both Stalinism and fascism and saying, look where this leads. This is the death of the human spirit.
And there's another satire from around the same time, On the Edge of Reason.
Also from the late 30s, 1938. Another brutal attack on social hypocrisy, this time about a respectable lawyer who one day at a dinner party decides to just start telling the absolute truth about everyone.
And I assume society does not react well to that.
Society declares him insane and tries to destroy him. It's a classic Krleža theme. The individual with a conscience versus a corrupt and conformist society.
Okay, so he's produced all of this, and then much later in the 60s, he drops what many consider his magnum opus, the novel series, The Banners.
Zastev, yes. If you talk to literary critics in the region, they will almost always call this the Croatian War and Peace.
That's a heavy comparison.
It is, and it's earned. It is massive. 5 volumes, thousands of pages. It's a huge panoramic view of Central European society in the years just before, during, and immediately after World War I.
So it's covering a lot of the same ground as his early life?
It is, but from the perspective of decades of reflection. It's deeply autobiographical in spirit. But at its core, it's a story about fathers and sons. The central conflict is between an old, powerful politician who is a loyalist to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his son, who becomes a revolutionary, a nationalist, and eventually a leftist. It's the prototypical theme of generational conflict.
The generation that built the old world versus the generation that wants to tear it down.
Precisely. It's a novel about ideas, about politics, about history, about love, about betrayal. It's everything. It's his attempt to capture the totality of that world-shattering experience. And it was recognized as such. It won the prestigious NIN Award in 1962.
Before we move to the politics, which is a whole other saga, I want to pause on the poetry, because there is one work in particular, the Ballads of Petrica Karempo, that seems to be in a league of its own. Scholars just rave about it.
This is, for many, his absolute masterpiece, his most unique, most untranslatable, most profound work. But it's also, for an outsider, the hardest to access. It was published in 1936.
Why is it so hard to access? What's the barrier?
The language. It comes down to the language he chose to write it in. You see, standard Croatian is based on the Shtukavian dialect, but Krleža wrote this entire epic book of poetry in Kushkavian.
Okay, explain that. What's the significance of Kushkavian?
Kushkavian is the dialect of northern Croatia, of Zagreb, of the region where he grew up, and importantly, it was seen as the dialect of the peasantry. By the 20th century, it was considered rustic, archaic, almost dead as a serious literary language. It wasn't what you use for high art.
So he deliberately dug it up.
He resurrected it. He did this incredible scholarly work. He went through old dictionaries, legal chronicles from in the 16th and 17th centuries, folk songs. And he built this incredibly rich, archaic, grotesque, and beautiful language from the ground up.
And who is the main character? Petrica Karempo.
He's a plebeian prophet. Think of him as a kind of Croatian Till Eulenspiegel, or a jester. He's a trickster figure, a peasant clown who wanders through Croatian history, always speaking truth to power.
So he's the guy mocking the kings and the bishops.
Exactly. The ballads cover more than 5 centuries of Croatian history, but told entirely from the bottom up. It's a history of peasant rebellions, of hangings, of crushing taxes, of endless wars fought for foreign masters. It's incredibly dark, but it's also brutally hilarious. It perfectly captures the gallows humor and deep cynicism of the peasant who knows that no matter who is in charge, the Turk, the Austrian, the Hungarian lord, the peasant is the one who's going to get beaten.
The lords change, the beating stays the same.
That is the absolute spirit of the book. And writing it in that dialect was a profound political act. He was saying, this culture, this peasant culture that you elites look down on, has value. It has a history. It is not just mud and superstition. It's an act of cultural reclamation.
Okay, so we've established beyond a doubt that he is a literary giant on a world scale. But he wasn't just writing in an ivory tower. He was a political animal from day one. Which brings us to part 3, the communist of his own making.
And this is where the story gets really, really dangerous for him.
He joined the Communist Party very early on, right?
Very early. 1918, right after the war, right after the Russian Revolution. He was a true believer in the beginning. He saw it as the only real answer to the imperialist carnage he'd witnessed in the war.
And he wasn't just a rank-and-file member?
Oh no, he was the intellectual engine of the left in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. He was the driving force behind all the most important leftist reviews and journals. Plamen the Flame, Kujrubna Republika, Literary Republic, Danas, Today, and later Pejat, The Stamp. If you were a young leftist writer, he was your editor, your mentor, your polemical leader.
He was a bad communist, at least according to the official line from Moscow.
He was a terrible Stalinist. And you know, that is probably the highest compliment I can pay him.
What was the problem? Where did he diverge?
You have to understand the context of the 1930s. The Communist International, run from Moscow, was enforcing a very rigid doctrine on all national parties. And in the arts, that doctrine was called socialist realism.
Right, the girl meets tractor school of art.
Chuckles. That's a great way to put it. Basically, art was supposed to be a tool. It had to be simple, didactic, and relentlessly optimistic. It existed only to serve the party's political goals. If you wrote a poem, it better be about how great the 5-year plan is. If you painted a picture, it had to be of heroic factory workers.
And Krleža, who was writing these dark, complex, modernist works about bad blood and existential crises, he did not fit that mold.
He hated it with a passion. He thought it was an insult to intelligence, an insult to art. He argued that a true socialist society shouldn't produce dumb propaganda. It should produce better art, more complex art, more truthful art than capitalism ever could. He absolutely refused to lower his aesthetic standards. His position was essentially, I can be a communist, but I will not write trash.
And it wasn't just about art, was it? It got much more serious than that. It was about the purges.
That was the ultimate breaking point. He watched from Zagreb as the Great Purge unfolded in the Soviet Union in the late 30s. He saw his friends, his comrades, loyal communists he knew personally being arrested, sent to the Gulag, or simply shot after show trials. And the official party line was to applaud, to say, yes, they were all traitors and spies.
Krleža refused.
He could not and would not do it. He saw it as a monstrous betrayal of the revolution's ideals. This led to what's known in Yugoslav history as the conflict on the literary left.
What was that exactly?
It was a brutal public intellectual civil war. Krleža, through his journal Pechat, launched a long and bitter polemic against the party dogmatists. He wrote these incredibly powerful essays, shredding their arguments, mocking their lack of talent, and exposing their blind, unthinking obedience to Stalin.
He was taking on the entire party apparatus.
Virtually every important writer on the left. And so in 1939, the inevitable happens.
He's expelled.
The Communist Party of Yugoslavia kicks out its most famous and brilliant intellectual. He's declared a revisionist, a Trotskyite, an enemy. He is completely isolated.
But there is a fascinating twist here, a very important historical cameo. Who was the party commissar sent to try and mediate this whole conflict before the final expulsion?
Josip Broz Tito.
The future leader of Yugoslavia, the marshal himself.
The very same. At the time, Tito was a high-ranking party functionary tasked with enforcing discipline. He was sent to Zagreb to talk some sense into Krleža to get him back in line. They had these long, intense conversations.
And what happened?
Well, ultimately, Tito couldn't save him from expulsion. Krleža was just too stubborn, too principled on the question of artistic freedom. But during those talks, they clearly formed a bond. They recognized a mutual intelligence, a pragmatism, and a certain toughness in each other. Tito saw that Krleža wasn't just some coffeehouse intellectual, and Krleža saw that Tito wasn't just a mindless apparatchik.
And that bond becomes a literal lifeline just a couple of years later, because in 1941, the whole world collapses. The Nazis invade Yugoslavia.
The Kingdom of Yugoslavia is destroyed in a matter of days. And in Croatia, a fascist puppet regime is established, the so-called independent state of Croatia, run by the Ustaše.
This must have been a uniquely terrifying time for Krleža. He's a known, prominent leftist. He's on every list imaginable.
It was an absolute nightmare. He was living in Zagreb, the capital of this new fascist state. The regime actually tried to woo him at first. They were nationalists, and they wanted the great Croatian writer to endorse their state, to give them legitimacy.
And he refused.
He refused completely. He went silent. He shut himself away in his villa.
But he also didn't run. Tito and the communist partisans were in the mountains, fighting a guerrilla war. Krleža stayed in Zagreb. Why?
It's that fundamental insider-outsider problem again, but with life or death stakes. On the one hand, he feared the Ustaše would arrest and kill him any day. But on the other hand, he also feared the partisans.
Why would he fear his own side?
Remember, he had just been expelled from the party in disgrace. He thought that if he went to the mountains, the hardline Stalinists surrounding Tito, the very people he'd been publicly fighting with, might just decide to put a bullet in his head for being a revisionist heretic. There was no love lost there.
So he was trapped between two enemies.
Completely trapped. He spent 4 years in constant fear, waiting for the knock on the door that could come from either side. He wrote nothing for publication. He just kept his head down and survived.
The war ends in 1945. The communists win. Tito is the undisputed master of a new, socialist Yugoslavia. Krleža survives. But he's in a very weird, very awkward spot. He didn't fight.
There was a lot of resentment. The fighters, the generals, the partisans who had spent 4 years in the mountains, they looked at him with disdain. They called him a salon communist, a coward who sat out the war in the comfort of his villa while they were bleeding for the cause. He was socially stigmatized for a brief period.
But Tito intervened. That earlier connection paid off.
Tito was, above all else, a pragmatist. He knew that a new state needed more than just guns and secret police. It needed a soul. It needed culture. It needed legitimacy. And Miroslav Krleža was the only intellectual figure in the entire country with the stature and gravity to provide that. So Tito personally rehabilitated him.
Which brings us to the astonishing second act of his life, Part 4, The Intellectual Statesman.
And it is a fascinating and deeply complex pivot, because in 1948, the unimaginable happens. Tito breaks with Stalin.
The Tito-Stalin split. It's a seismic event in the Cold War.
It's huge. Yugoslavia is kicked out of the Soviet bloc and becomes a non-aligned, independent socialist state. And suddenly, Miroslav Krleža looks like a prophet.
Of course. All those arguments he made in the 30s, that we shouldn't just blindly copy Russia, that art needs to be free from dogma, that Stalinism is a perversion, suddenly that becomes the new official state policy.
Exactly. The party now needs to prove that Yugoslav socialism is fundamentally different from and better than Soviet socialism. It needs a cultural identity.
So Krleža becomes the architect of that difference.
He does. In 1952, at the Congress of Yugoslav Writers in Ljubljana, he gives a speech that changes everything. It's a landmark address where he basically tells the assembled writers of the nation, you are free. He officially kills socialist realism in Yugoslavia. He argues for artistic freedom, for modernism, for experimentation.
That is a massive legacy. Because of that speech and his influence, Yugoslav art in the 60s and 70s was light years ahead of what was happening in Poland or Hungary or East Germany. You had abstract art, avant-garde theater, experimental film, and eventually a huge punk rock scene.
And it was largely because Krleža stood next to Tito and said, let them create, let them play, our system is strong enough to handle it.
He became a man of institutions. He was made vice president of the Academy of Science and Arts. And then, in 1950, he founded the Yugoslav Institute for Lexicography.
Ah, the lexicographer. It sounds a bit dry, a bit boring, but for him, this was a project of immense passion and national importance.
He wanted to create an encyclopedia. Why does an encyclopedia matter so much to a poet and a novelist?
Because an encyclopedia is a definition of the world. It's an ordering of knowledge. Until then, if you were a student in Zagreb or Belgrade and you wanted to know about history or science or art, you probably looked at a German encyclopedia or a Russian one. The world was defined for you by the great powers.
And Krleža wanted a South Slavic perspective.
He wanted to catalog the knowledge of the region, for the region. He wanted to prove that these small nations had a rich history worth preserving, that they had contributed to world culture. It was an act of intellectual self-assertion. And he ran that institute like his own personal kingdom, with Tito's full backing until the day he died.
And his personal relationship with Tito. Our sources say they were genuinely close.
Very close. There are many photographs of them together, walking on Tito's private island of Brujuni, drinking, talking for hours. It was a deeply symbiotic relationship.
The dictator and the writer.
Exactly. Tito gave Krleža protection, power, and resources, and Krleža gave Tito's regime intellectual legitimacy and a sophisticated cultural face to show the world. It's a fascinating dynamic.
Let's move to the final chapter, Part 5. He's now living the life of a high-profile, state-sponsored intellectual.
He is the cultural patriarch. He's living at Villa Gavos in the beautiful Tukanak Hills of Zagreb. It's a cultural court. He's receiving international awards, the prestigious Herder Prize in 1968, the Botev Prize in 1981. He is the Red Monarch of Yugoslav culture.
In his personal life, we haven't touched on that much.
He was married to one person his entire adult life, Leposava Kangruka, always known as Bella. She was a famous and very respected theater actress. They were together for over 60 years. They were the ultimate power couple of Zagreb.
If you wanted something done in the cultural world, if you wanted a book published or a play staged, you went to Gavos to get their blessing. But the end of his life, it feels so symbolic. It feels like the curtain coming down on the whole grand experiment of his life and his country.
It really does. The timing is uncanny. First, Tito dies in May of 1980. And with his death, the glue that held the multi-ethnic state of Yugoslavia together is gone. You can feel the ground starting to shift.
He lost his protector.
He lost his protector and his partner in that strange political dance. Then, less than a year later, his wife Bella dies in April 1981.
After 60 years together.
60 years. He is left completely alone. He was already in ill health, but by all accounts, he was heartbroken and deeply depressed. And he dies just a few months later, in December of 1981, in that same villa.
Wow. So within the space of about 18 months, the three pillars of his world are gone. Tito, Bella, and then himself.
And just a few years after that, the country that they had all in their own ways built and sustained began to unravel into a horrific civil war. His death really marks the end of an era.
He was given a state funeral, I imagine?
Oh, a massive one. In Zagreb on January 4th, 1982. It wasn't the funeral of a writer, it was the funeral of a head of state, basically. The entire political and cultural elite was there.
So, if we were to go to Zagreb today, what's left of his legacy? Can you still feel his presence?
You can. It's still very heavy. Velivozd was donated to the city of Zagreb, and you can visit it. It's a museum kept almost exactly as he left it, with his vast library of thousands of books. It feels like he just stepped out for a walk.
And there's a monument.
Yes, a beautiful bronze monument was placed near his home in 2004. He's sitting, looking pensive, heavy, almost like a mountain himself. And of course, the institute he founded is now named the Miroslav Krleža Institute of Lexicography. It's still the premier scholarly institution of its kind in Croatia.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize all of this. We've gone from the military academy to the trenches, through plays and novels, into party politics and state building. What does it all mean? What's the final takeaway?
I think if you had to boil it down to one thing, we are looking at a man who fundamentally refused to simplify the world. That is his core intellectual trait. He lived in a century of brutal, simplistic ideologies that demanded you pick a side and shut off your brain. Empire, nationalism, Stalinism, fascism. Krleža engaged with all of them. He fought them. He worked within them. But he never, ever surrendered his critical mind completely to any one of them.
Even when he was Tito's personal advisor, even when he was at the heart of the establishment.
Even then, he was the communist of his own making. He never stopped being a critic. He proved that it was possible to be committed to a project of social justice without sacrificing your artistic standards or your intellectual integrity. He carved out a space for complexity in an age of dogma.
And he gave a voice to a very specific historical experience.
That's the Croat-Iliad idea. He took the experience of a small nation on the periphery of great empires, a nation that was always the soldier, never the general, and he made it universal. His work constantly asks the big questions. What is the point of all this suffering? What is the meaning of history when you're on the receiving end of it?
You know, I keep coming back to that tension we talked about. Between the rebel and the statesman, we have this romantic idea of the dissident writer who dies in poverty, screaming the truth from a garret. But Krleža, he put on a suit. He went into the palace. He drank with the dictator.
He did. And I think that's the provocative thought we should probably end on. What is more effective? Is it better to be the pure, uncompromising outsider, throwing rocks at the walls of the palace and ultimately changing nothing? Or is it better to be the compromised insider, the one who walks into the palace and actually changes the policy? Krleža chose the palace. And because he did, generations of artists, writers, and thinkers in Yugoslavia had a degree of freedom that was simply unimaginable anywhere else in the Eastern Bloc.
He compromised on his position, maybe, but not on his principles. He rearranged the furniture inside the rooms so the next generation had a place to sit.
That is a perfect way to put it. A perfectly Krležian way to put it.
That's it for this deep dive into the colossal, complicated life of Miroslav Krleža.
A true titan of the 20th century.
Thanks for listening. We'll catch you on the next one.